All right, so we are now recording this meeting on April 28th, 2020 with Indigenous scholar and author Dina Gilio-Whitaker. Thank you for joining our Northeastern State University community, and thank you for the sponsorship of this meeting from the Center for Tribal Studies at NSU. And I am so grateful for the opportunity this semester to teach history of Native American women, and for the students and their perseverance and excellent work that they're doing that inspired this meeting with Dina and her incredible work to have this conversation about her work. I'm going to briefly introduce Dina before I turn the time over to her to present to us for about 40 minutes. And then we will open the remaining time, about 30 minutes, to a direct conversation with her, questions, comments with some of our students and NSU community and those affiliated with us who have been able to join this live Zoom meeting. And we are recording this meeting to share on the Center for Tribal Studies Facebook page. And folks, if they have questions or such insights as that, I'm sure Dina, she is wonderful at responding and being accessible and having continuing conversations with everyone. So please be sure to follow her and her work. So Dina, a scholar of Indigenous studies from the Colville Confederated Tribes, is policy director and senior research associate at the Center for World Indigenous Studies. She teaches American Studies at California State University at San Marcos. For many years, she has been doing the work of a public intellectual in her blog writing, Ruminative. Dina's interests focus on issues related to Indigenous nationalism, self-determination, and environmental justice, writing on the intersection of indigeneity and surfing. She is co-author with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz of the acclaimed book, All the Real Indians Are Died Off, and 20 Other Myths About Native Americans from Beacon Press, published in 2016. She also recently published a book, As Long as the Grass Grows, which is a tremendous contribution as well. Let me look at the full title, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock. So I think that's what we will hear more about today as we talk about Indigenous woman activism, especially in the late 20th century to early 21st century. She is a very well-accomplished freelance journalist, a writer, author, has several published articles, types of letters to editors, or just different writings that have been very influential and mind-blowing, opening, enlightening for many people, including myself. And I thank Dina for that. That's how I connected with her, is reading some of her works in Indian country today, and how she questions and complicates, terms even that we use all the time, like Indigenous sovereignty and what that means. And so that's where I was really drawn to her work and following her, and have been fortunate to connect with her, once being on a panel with her, and am honored and know that this is a treat and a privilege, an opportunity to learn from such a groundbreaking scholar who is really helping us pave the way and making the world a better place, helping us to really come together and recognize Indigenous histories, experiences, and what they're going through. So thank you so much, Dina Gilio-Whitaker, for being a Native American woman, an Indigenous woman who is making history through your work, as well as through how you're assessing that. So we'll turn the time over to Dina now. And again, please pay attention, everyone. We will love to have an ongoing conversation with her after her talk. Thank you, Dina. Ahehe, thank you, Wado.
Oh, why pisnaxiel ku isqueeze Dina Gilio-Whitaker is makalak squeeze nux baus. Thank you for that amazing introduction. Oh my God, that's a lot to live up to. So let me go ahead and begin my screen share. Wait, let's see. Okay. And let me find my PowerPoint. Okay, where are you? Oops, let's go over here. And cue that up. There we go. Okay, so let's see. I come to you from I live in Southern California in a place called Orange County, and I am living in the traditional and unceded territory of the Ahashiman people. And I teach at Cal State San Marcos in the unceded and traditional territory of the Payam Luiseño and shared territories with the Kumeyaay people and others. So just to give that accurate um, situating of who and where I am, I consider myself an urban Indian. Although I'm I'm actually a descendant of the Colville Confederated Tribes. I consider myself first generation born and raised off the reservation. So I came to be born and raised in Los Angeles after my mother, who was a tribal member, moved to Southern California in the late 1950s during this period of termination in which we have this major demographic shift that happens in Indian country as a result of that federal policy. And so I consider myself really a direct product of that policy, where the federal government's intention was to eliminate Native people politically and absorb us all into the body politic of the American social fabric. And thus we all would forget about who we were, and we would no longer exist as political bodies. So that's how I come to this work. It's really a lifelong journey of self-discovery and understanding myself within the context of that history. This is really what propelled me kind of later on in life to do this work, even going back to school and getting a degree in Native American Studies, and then going on to grad school to continue in that work. So it's very personal to me, and it's not just theoretical. So so I want to look at, we're going to kind of do kind of a century-long look at Native women's activism, and I'll kind of get into why it's a century here as I switch my screens. So just a little bit more about my background here. I want to minimize that a little bit. There we go. So I do, as Dr. King mentioned, I do teach and write. And I really came to this work as a sort of a scrappy grassroots journalist back in the early 2000s. I'd always aspired to be a writer, but I really came to it as an activist, being in what I call an in the streets activist. When I was living in Northern California, and there was this long story short, big casino battle that happened up there that I got drawn into and was infuriated by, and that spurred on my activism as a writer. So that's really what writing is for me. I'm not one of those kind of like fiction or not fiction writers. I can't write stories. Like, I suck at that. I don't do stories and like that kind of creative writing. Like, I just can't do that. So I'm really more of an essayist and now book author. So and so I went back to school to become more well-rounded in my education and hone my writing skills. That was really the driver for me as far as higher education. So I got out of grad school. I did not go into a PhD program. I went into a master's program, got out of that, and for a lot of complicated reasons decided not to finish a PhD or go into a PhD. Instead, I went into a research job immediately out of grad school and was working for the Center for World Indigenous Studies. I'm no longer the policy director there. I do work with them on a volunteer basis, as I think it's an amazing organization, but I'm more focused on the teaching and writing and a lot of public speaking. So I do a lot of training and educating outside the university setting. So, but in the university at Cal State San Marcos, where I teach American Indian Studies, I teach courses on religion and philosophy. I teach 2 courses on environmental issues. One of them is called like Native Americans and Environmental Issues, and then this course on traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, which is one of my favorite courses to teach because it's actually really community based. And because we live in San Diego, and I'm going to give you a little bit of fun fact here. Most people don't know this, but in San Diego has more Indian reservations in the county than anywhere else in the United States. There's 18 in total in the county, and they're all small. They're not big reservations like, you know, the Navajo Nation, or, you know, some of the Sioux reservations, or even my reservation, the Colville Reservation in Washington State. They're small, and they're very close together. So it makes for a really excellent environment to be able to go out into the community, take students out, and that's our approach to teaching American Indian Studies at Cal State San Marcos. Very community oriented, taking students out into the community to learn about the subject matter by really integrating or interacting with local Native communities in a wide variety of ways. And that's one of the ways that we do that with this course, this TEK course. I also teach a course on sports, American Indians in sports, which is a new course. We're really expanding our course offerings in our department. And I love teaching that one. And I'll talk about that even in a minute. And then I teach the course on American Indian women's activism. And that's also one of my favorite courses to teach. And I'm actually teaching that this semester, and we're at the end of our semester right now. And so we're kind of wrapping up in all of our classes in our semester here. And it's a great course to teach because it's an upper division course. So there's a lot of engagement. People are always very, very active in participating in that course. And even though it's mostly non-Native students that enroll in these courses, we do get a fair amount of Native students. But it's always very engaging. Okay, let's see. So the way that I teach the course is that I divide that course up into 3 broad sections. And the first section, we spend like the first third of the class talking about feminism, and do like a comparative feminisms, you know, plural, by starting out talking about mainstream feminism. And so doing this sort of chronology, this historical perspective, talking about how mainstream feminism started and where it began in, you know, roughly the mid 19th century. And, you know, in upstate New York, with some activists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as you see in the photograph here, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, and Lucretia Mott, among others. These were women who were living around Syracuse, New York, you know, who in some very oppressive times, even for white women. I draw on the work by a scholar named Sally Roche Wagner, who wrote this amazing little book called Sisters in Spirit. And this is a very thin volume, but she goes deep, and she's a feminist scholar. She's non-Native, But she is very close to a lot of Native women, especially Iroquois, Haudenosaunee women in that area, because that's where she teaches in Syracuse, New York. And so she wrote this book, Sisters and Spirits, a long time ago. I think it was first published in 1991. And so her work really begins, her work in feminism, feminist studies begins with looking at how these 19th century women were influenced by their interactions with Haudenosaunee women who they lived very close to in that area. And so and it always surprises me that, you know what, I'm going to turn off, let's see, hold on a second. Oh, I'm sorry about that noise. Oh, I should have turned that off. Well, now I can't get out of here. Well, we'll just have to ignore it. So she's one of the few and only people that actually look at feminist history through this lens, through understanding how Iroquois, the Iroquois Clan Mother Society, and the norms inside Iroquois and Haudenosaunee societies, come to really help shape the foundation of mainstream American feminism. So I like to pay a lot of attention to that. I recommend the book, but I also show this film right here. She's got a lovely talk that she does at this link, where it's like really good. It's only like an hour and 15 minutes long, this video, for a quick, good overview of that work that she does. So there's a good resource for you. So in the section on feminism, the way I teach it, we start with mainstream feminism, and then we talk about how other women of color feminisms emerge, through the civil rights era, the 1960s, with Black feminists, with Chicana feminists, and how these feminisms emerge out of the racial differences of women of color, and how Black women and Chicana women and other women of color, their issues really emerge as different than white mainstream middle class feminism. So that sort of lays the groundwork for us to then talk about Indigenous feminism, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I want to do this quick little detour. So I'm going to get a little personal here, and give you some background context about me. I do consider myself a feminist. I'm also an athlete. I'm also in my early 60s. And so I have this friend that I teach with at Cal State San Marcos. Her name is Pam Rodella. She's here on the left. She's in her early 50s, and she's a surf buddy and ski buddy. So her and I go surfing and skiing together. And as to just kind of, set the example of what it means to be like a woman in our age group, that and to be healthy. And so that we don't have to age and get old and and decrepit and feeble. We can be badass, like athletic women and strong women, and still be committed even to our Indigenous projects. So I live in the intersection of all these kind of different places. So okay, I want to get out of that. I want to show you, I'm bragging now, okay? I'm going to show you this film. And I know what I wanted to say was Pam and I, and the first day of the semester, because she teaches feminist studies at Cal State San Marcos, her and I team teach the first day of my class of Native American women's activism. And so she does this like long retrospective of feminism going back all the way to, like the Middle Ages and European women and some of their projects in the female feminine liberation. And so this last year when we taught this class, her and I had just come back from the ski trip together, and she's a snowboarder, I'm a skier, and we showed this, we did this video of, I videoed her snowboarding and me on skis filming her, and so I just wanted to show you how badass women like us can be. Just for a little inspiration, I showed this to the class and they really liked it. It's only about 3 minutes and there's no music or anything. But we got off the chairlift and we skied straight from the top to the bottom without stopping, which is not that easy. It's for old ladies like us. Okay, minor detour there. Let me get rid of this. Go back to my screen and okay. So just I'm like putting aside all my indigenous humility, and I do believe in humility, but at the same time, I think that it's important for us to acknowledge our accomplishments too, and to set the example for people younger than us. And this is what 50 and 60 can look like. So take care of yourself, and there's no telling what you can do once you get when you get to your older years. So okay, back to feminism. In the section on feminism, then we come to indigenous feminism. So we lay that foundation to talk about what indigenous feminism looks like. And indigenous feminism is, I think that probably one of the first things to say about it is that it's kind of controversial, at least in Indian country. And we talk about that a lot, how not all Native women activists, would call themselves feminists, and for various reasons. Personally, as I mentioned, I embrace feminism. I embrace Indigenous feminism. This is a really good text that I teach from. So another resource there for you if you're interested in this topic. Maybe Dr. King is already teaching from this great book. And there are only a handful of others. We really need more of a literature on it, but it is a growing literature. Madonna Thunderhawk is somebody who does embrace, she's an elder, Lakota elder from, I think she's from Standing Rock. And she did this film that came out last year called Warrior Women, and maybe that's a film that you have seen in your class. It's fantastic retrospective on the activism of the Red Power movement of the 1960s that she was, deeply, deeply a part of. And so in this idea of Indigenous feminism that she does embrace, which is what I like about the way she's pretty open about that. It's different than mainstream and other women of color feminisms primarily because Native women, emphasize that they come from nations, and their commitments, their ideological commitments are to um, the survival and uh, for just the resurgence and the protection of their tribes as nations. Um, so that's a really different set of concerns for Indigenous women that other women, even women of color, don't have. We are protecting land bases and sovereignty and tradition. So tradition, Native women's tradition, our Indigenous knowledge is a huge, deep part of that. So these are knowledge systems that are, epistemologies that, as we know, are very, very different from the kinds of epistemologies and knowledge systems that other women of color and non-Native women activists work within. So our work is always about protecting all of these things. So that's the section on on feminism. So we dive really deep into that, and that then lays sort of the terms of our engagement for the rest of the class. And the second section of the class, the way that I teach about it, is it goes into social movements. And so in that section, we talk about, we do sort of a chronology, a historical retrospective, which it sounds like Dr. King's work, that's really the focus of what she does, and goes really deep into that history. The way that I teach it is that we go into I start with early 20th century organizing, because you don't really see formal American Indian organizing until about 1911, and the the so-called Red Progressive movement during the Progressive era in the United States. And so this is really encapsulated by the Society of American Indians, SAI. SAI is an organization that is the first. It's not the first Native rights organization of the era, but it's the first Native American, or Indian. In those days they would have said Indian rights organization that was run by and for Indian people. There were others before it that were, rights advocacy organizations that were, run by white people, settler people. But SAI emerged as the first real social movement by Native people. And it comes out of that, ironically, out of the boarding school period, because, um, you know, 19, if we think about 1911, this is deep, deep within the federal policy of assimilation and the Dawes Act, right? It's legislated by the Dawes Act, which, as we know, was as much about education as it was about um, allotment of land. And so the boarding schools, Native kids are being sent off to boarding schools and to be, forcefully assimilated. But it has this really interesting other kind of effect and impact, and it's that Native people become educated in settler society, and they go off to college, and they become professionals. They get law degrees and medical degrees, and they become journalists, and they become writers, and people that are very influential in these very public facing ways. And it's not just men. It's is just as many women who are, who found this movement. So working side by side with Native men in ways that that white women really weren't doing or weren't even allowed to do. So if you think about 1911 to so 1911, when SAI starts, this is a time well before Native white women have the right even to vote. I mean, it's years before white women have the right to vote. So, so this is like the kind of the foundation, and you have women like Angel Decorah and Zikala Sa or Gertrude Bonin, Suzanne LaFlèche. Um, Gosh, there's Laura Cornelius Kellogg, who's been written about a lot. In my own tribe, we had somebody named Christine Quintasket, also known as Morning Dove, who was doing her own kind of activism separate from the SAI. She was never involved in SAI, but she was in Washington on the Calva Reservation doing a lecture circuit, and ultimately became one of the very first Native women to write a novel. So, and before her, you had Sarah Winnemucca, who was Paiute, doing also the Chautauquas, going and talking in her traditional dress and exposing settler society to Native perspectives. So this is really really marks the beginning of Native women's activism in the early 20th century. Then we move into the mid 20th century and the Red Power movement, which is really exemplified by people like Madonna Thunderhawk, Phyllis Young, Winona LaDuke began her early activism as a young woman during this time period. Janet McLeod, Wilma Mankiller. There's numerous of these women that we could talk about, that films have been made about and books have been written about, and who are still out there, doing the work. And so in that time period, the Red Power movement, we really see this is the period of civil rights. It's the civil rights movement in the U.S. The thing about the Red Power movement that I like to connect to is that one of the things that makes it that's different for Native women's activism in this period is that it's really deeply tied to environmental activism. And this is the way I've written about it in my book, As Long as Grass Grows. In that book, there's an entire chapter about women's roles at Standing Rock, because the book looks at Standing Rock as an example of environmental injustice and how it has played out historically for Indian country. And in that chapter on women's activism, I write about that a lot, and really how we can trace environmental or Native women's activism in that period to the women of all red nations. So Warren really emerges as the first Native women's activist organization that branches off from the American Indian movement, as because Native women have concerns of their own. There were problems with the organizing in America, in AIM, with very patriarchal attitudes. Native men are still decolonizing, because AIM really starts as an urban Indian movement, and Native men who have been raised outside of their tribal traditions in as very assimilated people really replicate the patriarchy of the society that they were raised in. And so Native women or, react to that and respond to that with their own kind of organizing. And some of that organizing really comes out of the reservation environment, notably Pine Ridge, with which was women were experiencing huge reproductive rights issues, especially around contamination of their water, which led to high incidence of miscarriage because of uranium contamination from the uranium mining in that area. There's a lot of miscarriage, there's a lot of birth defects and other kinds of reproductive issues that affect women, where that kind of toxicity affect women differently than it affects men. So they form their own study, and out of that study, they start working with legislators to study that, and also some other issues that were affecting Native women at this time, which include the adoption, high rates of Native children being adopted out. We have studies that begin to show how a third of all Native children were being systematically removed from their Indian families, taken away from their mothers, and raised in white family and foster care and adoption. And then also the high rate of non-consensual sterilizations, which was happening systematically through the Indian Health Service. So these are all, huge issues that were very at the forefront of Native women's organizing in this time period. Then, so that grows, right? From there, this is the mid-60s. Now you have a really strong, identifiable base of Native women's organizing and activism that's separate from other Native activism. And we move into the 20th century with a movement, probably the most definable or identifiable social movement of this time is the Idle No More movement. Prior to the Idle No More movement, we did have the Occupy Wall Street movement that was really sweeping through, around 2011, after the economic crash in 2008 and the mortgage debacle, and the crash of the economy at that time leads to this, very vocal critique about capitalism. And, after the banks get bailed out and people don't get bailed out, and this huge resurgence of the critique of capitalism. But and it happens through the occupation of public spaces like Zuccotti Park in New York, and other places where activists are doing these occupations. But out of those occupations emerges indigenous perspectives, and those perspectives are that, hey, the United States is is already occupied land. So, what does it mean for activists, like anti-capitalist activists, to occupy land that is already indigenous land that is already occupied? And so there became a split in that movement, where the activists really weren't too open to that critique, and so it led to kind of a Native people sort of opting out of that particular social movement because we couldn't get heard. And progressive and liberal activists, they ignored our concerns. And this is something that we have to keep, it became blaring at that time. And so as Native activists, one of our projects is to really call that out, how this activism, how liberal projects, activist projects, have to include Indigenous perspectives, or they're not, they're not complete. So Idle No More emerges in about 2012. It was December 2012 in Canada, which of course begins with this group of 4 women, 3 of whom are Native, and it's as a response to this suite of legislation that the federal Canadian government was promoting, that was very anti-Native and very anti-environment under the government of Stephen Harper, who is a notoriously conservative. And so it's the first time that we have an Indigenous social movement in the social media era. And so social media really mediates this kind of activism in a way that makes it go, literally, like, or figuratively, viral. But it goes global because of social media. So now Native concerns are not just localized, they are broadcast to the entire world and can be known that way. And so we see that ground shifting in this era because of social media. So the Idle No More movement sparks a renewed kind of global consciousness about Indigenous injustice, and how that injustice and Indigenous concerns are tied to the environment, always, always, always explicitly tied to the environment, because it's always about the protection of land for us. And people can start to see that, what happens, that there's this connection between ecocide and genocide. Ecocide being sort of a play on that word genocide, which means, ecocide is the killing of an environment. It has always gone hand in hand for Indigenous people, but in the modern world, with climate change and all the other, massive environmental issues that we face, we're all like subject to that now. We're all subject to, what will turn out to be an ecocidal reality that is not just impacting Indigenous people anymore, although we are always disproportionately impacted. So Idle No More brought us that consciousness, this global consciousness. And so then within 4 years, we have the Standing Rock movement. And probably all of us on this call right now were probably pretty aware of what was going on and watching it go down in real time, again, thanks to social media and all those Facebook live streams that showed us, moment by moment, the abuses of, the injustice and the abuses of police, militarized police, and what was happening on the ground there. So Standing Rock.
Stop, baby, stop. Yeah.
So deep into this
Hi, Dina.
about, huh?
Hi, Dina. We lost you for a little bit when you were starting to talk about Standing Rock. Um,
Oh,
but also, just to point out as well, I don't know if how much more you wanted to continue in terms of the presentation, but just a heads up on timing. If we want to have some questions and comments, I know some folks may have to leave in the next 15 minutes. So just
okay.
give you some heads up there. Okay.
Okay, yeah, I'm kind of coming to the wrap up part of it.
Okay.
So maybe what, 5 minutes?
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, so this, I just got a sign that said my internet connection was unstable. I'm not really sure what that's about, but I will forge on. So the third section of the class, we got talk about issues. And so we spend 5 weeks talking about issues that we break down into broad categories of gender and sexuality, violence against Native women, and environment and health. So making all those connections. In the section on gender and sexuality, we talk about gender roles and how Native women's um, how Native women have become disempowered through colonization, through patriarchal colonialism, and how that really kind of frames the way that we talk about our feminist issues in this day and age, and then sexuality in terms of gender identity and what that looks like, and how in Native societies we have gender fluidity. We traditionally most of our Indigenous societies are gender fluid. We acknowledge more than two binary genders. There's a beautiful film that I like to show on this. We talk about two spirits from the American Indian perspective, and then we also talk about Native Hawaiian gender issues. And I show this film called Kumuhina, which is just this beautiful, beautiful film about a transgender Native Hawaiian Mahu woman named Kumuhina, and it's the journey of her and her identity issues and her marriage to a Tongan man. Highly recommend another resource there for your toolbox. Then we talk about violence against Native women, which is, of course, something really very well known to us. Finally, we're getting some traction, what little bit there is on missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is, again, connected to environmental issues, especially around, fossil fuel extraction and the man camps, as we know, in the Bakken oil fields, for example, in North Dakota, where so much missing women, or the problem of missing women happens. And then, so we talk about that. We look at studies and statistics, and we make the distinction between, what does it look like for reservation women and the jurisdictional issues compared to, what does it look like for urban Native women, and where jurisdiction isn't so much an issue, where it's more a question of data gathering and not even knowing the extent of the problem. So, of course, that's a huge issue for us. It's in our faces right now, every day. And then finally, we talk about, how environment, again, there's that common thread that is woven throughout all the way that I see it, that thread that's woven throughout all the issues. We cannot talk about activism and not talk about environment. Even going back to the SAI, the Society of American Indians, they would never have talked about it in like using that term, but it was always about protecting land and stopping the allotment back in those days. That was always about protecting sovereignty and land. And we still talk about those things today. Only now we talk about it in the modern terms of contamination and pollution and climate change. And then what, our health, our physical health, and our environment, our emotional health, how that factors into all of it. And that's how we wrap up the course, try to bring it back to a more positive thing and talk about mindfulness and wellness. So that's just a little, a little snapshot of my course, how I talk about Native women's activism, and I'm going to stop there. And if you have some questions, let's talk.
Thank you so much, Dina. I know it's like happy hands clapping. Oh, this is the moment when we'd be in a hall and give you a hand for sharing your research and your insights from teaching this course. And it's very interesting, teaching a course on the history of Native American women and thinking about similarities, overlaps, and differences with one that would be focused specifically on Indigenous women's activism. So thank you so much for sharing and meeting with us and talking with us today. So now we do have time for some questions, comments, feedback from those listening in on the live Zoom meeting. And I wanted to first give priority to our students in the History of Native American Women course that we have with us today, and they were asked to think and prepare some. So any questions from that group before I open it to our other community members with us today? Or I can call on them. Hopefully they're all listening still. I know you are. Any brave soul want to go first? Let's see. Sam, you brave? I see you there. You can click on. Go ahead, Sam. You can unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you. My name is Sam Phillips. I'm a senior. I'm studying American Indian Studies with a focus on sovereignty, health, and current issues, as well as legal studies and pre-law. I'm a member of the Cherokee Nation. I was just curious, as far as current issues, if there was anything that you're currently involved in or focusing on when it comes to activism.
I think activism is a tricky word. I think that it can mean a lot of different things, and I really don't see a hard line between what I do as an educator, as a writer, as sort of, a fairly public person. I don't see any difference between that and activism. To me, that is my activism. Like it's my entire life is structured around, bringing to light Indigenous issues in whatever that the current conversation is. So for me right now, in this time of COVID-19, I mentioned that as a journalist, that's my activism, my journalism, my work as a journalist emerged out of my street activism. And so I consider myself an activist journalist. And so the latest piece that I wrote was published in High Country News a couple of weeks ago, where I made connections between, I just learned about this whole field of study called planetary health. And it turns out to be this new academic discipline that really did not appear until about 2015. It's a very interdisciplinary, it's very science-based. It's scholars in medicine and epidemiology and virology and ecology and environmental studies, like all coming together to look at how the environment is impacting human health. And there's a real big emphasis on pandemics, because all of the work of these scholars have been saying for years that, it's not a question of if, but when the big pandemic comes, that will be threatening to the human race. And it's because of, they're explicit about this. It's because of human encroachment into natural environments, the, declining biodiversity, extractive industries, all that kind of stuff is the evidence is all there that, humans are releasing, they're coming into contact with these pathogens that we wouldn't ordinarily come into contact with because of our encroachment into these natural spaces. Um, and, you know, I mean, all of these pathogens, you know, Ebola and MERS and SARS, and I mean, there's a whole lot of other ones that I keep learning about, really have emerged in the last about 20 years that are really threatening to human health. And so my argument is that indigenous knowledge needs to be paid attention to, because it's about how we imagine a sustainable society, a society that is sustainable, because as Native peoples, our societies were by definition sustainable because we lived on the land for 15,000 plus years without destroying our environments and without destroying ourselves. So this is a problem. My argument is about epistemology and philosophy. So indigenous knowledge is is critical for imagining a better future on the earth, and science needs to pay attention to it. That's what I'm thinking about well, all the time, but especially in the context of pandemics. It's critical right now.
Oh, thank you for that, Dina. I also want to point out, so I know some folks might have only scheduled in till, you know, quarter till the hour. So some folks might have to leave us, but you can post questions in the chat box that we can bring to Dina. And then you can also message me privately to ask if you want to talk directly, and I can turn the time over to you too. Dina, are you okay with staying a little longer? You know,
yeah, I have plenty of time.
Okay, for some questions and conversation here. Thank you. So next, Sarah. Sarah, you had a question for Dina. Sarah Wood. You can unmute yourself. Or I can try to unmute you. Hi, Sarah. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Sarah Wood. I'm a member of the Cherokee Nation. I'm studying history and political science at NSU. My question was, do you think Native women are recognized or at the forefront of Native activism, like in contrast to like at the male-dominated?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, without hesitation. The difference, I think Native women, well, as we know, Native women have always been leaders in their communities. Our societies, you know, by and large, were gender equitable. So, which means that, you know, power was shared between men and women, and we didn't have patriarchal systems for the most part. I think it varies from tribe to tribe, and, you know, some tribal nations were more probably gender equitable than others, but in general, this seems to be the pattern historically. And it's only because of colonization. I mean, the research is really clear on this. It's only because of colonization that we have the imposition of patriarchy into our societies. And, you know, it's really, as you probably already know this, but it's really apparent in the Cherokee Nation, especially, where colonization really results in the disempowerment of Cherokee women in some really terrible ways. And so now we're talking about these things in these modern terms like feminism, so to reclaiming that power. But, you know, it's already embedded, and this is one of the things that makes Indigenous feminism different than all other feminisms, is that we already have those traditions to draw on. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just have to go back to our traditions and revive those. And I think that that's one of the differences in Indigenous feminism, that's what we're doing. We're just bringing those back, going back to our traditions to point out how we just, you know, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So yeah, I mean, it's unquestioned that's the case, that women are leaders in their communities. And Standing Rock Idle No More and Standing Rock really showed us that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dina. Brian, you had a question you wanted to ask. Let me unmute you. Go ahead.
Thanks. Siona God, Brian Broad, Doctor, Tal Kodjanel, Tosco Sudali, Yawadatiud, Joggy, Yayeti, Chijagi. Hi, guys. My name is Brian, and I work in the Native American Support Center at Northeastern State University. We're a Native American Serving Non-Tribal grant that was written by the Center for Tribal Studies. So our office, alongside CTS, works together to support Native students at NSU. I think your work is really awesome. It's something really cool to get to tune into on a Tuesday morning and hear all of this Indigenous excellence and, just thinking through all these historical traumas but also the historical strength that exists. That you're right, that these things do exist within our cultures and we just have to find strength in them and utilize them. And so in thinking about that and how you've studied all of these movements, and, I feel weird about the word activism too, or even the word protest. And I like how during Standing Rock, we're not protesters, we're protectors. This is our job as people to protect these resources, to protect this land that provides. And so at the risk of making my bosses nervous, I would like to ask you about a contemporary issue we have here in the Cherokee Nation. We have, an industry encroaching on these natural environments that you're talking about. Poultry is a big concern in our area. And in my mind, I like to think of it as our standing rock, that we have this moneyed interest that wants to utilize our resources and not show any benefit to us or to care for the environment that we utilize, the water we drink, the water we bathe in, the water we fish in, we play in, is just another thing that they can put waste in. So we have these large, closed, they're called CAFOs, closed chicken operations. So thousands of birds in one location, and that waste is relatively unregulated by the state. And tribes are stripped of the authority by Congress to stipulate water standards on a federal level. And so, in studying all these movements, I've been talking about this for a year plus now, and really having a hard time getting Native and non-Native folks alike to understand that the threat we're under here. And it's really hard when we're in the middle of COVID because, you can only, fight one front. And I understand everyone's really just trying to make it through this difficult time. But from your experience, from your studies, from witnessing these events, studying Standing Rock, how do you get people to wake up and to protect the environment that we need? How do we organize? What does Indigenous organizing look like? I know that's a lot of questions, but I'm just really curious. I wanted to expose you to something that we're dealing with here and see what you think.
The problems are unlimited. I mean, it's overwhelming at times. But what comes to mind is that, especially outside reservation boundaries, but even inside reservation boundaries, but outside reservation boundaries, these are issues of environmental justice. That's the way I see it. And so we have to look at environmental justice as a whole different animal. If you haven't read my book, you'll see that the argument that my book makes is that environmental justice needs to be indigenized. This is long-term. Like, we have to change the way that we think about what environmental justice looks like and what environmental organizing looks like. But what's clear is that one of the things that works is collaboration. And that's in many cases, that's one of the only thing that works, is that we have to collaborate with non-Native people. Non-Native interests need to collaborate with Native people too. So because they're not just shared interests, but there are also legal protections that can extend to Native, like a kind of an extra layer of law and policy that can benefit non-Native organizing. That's what I wrote about. So when I did my book, As Long as Grass Grows, really began as a master's thesis where I did a case study about something and a thing that happened here in the community where I live in, the beach community where I live in, where a sacred site was protected, a native sacred site was protected, but it's a non-federally recognized tribe on land that is not held in trust for the tribe. And so the long and short of it was that the site got protected, but it wasn't because it was a sacred site entirely. That factored into it, into the protecting of the site, but it was part of other considerations that defeated this development project that was going to happen there. And so it's really, you know, if you read the book by Zoltan Grossman called Unlikely Alliances, his book is really clear about that too, that we are living in an age where we have to work in alliance with other people. That's where our strength is going to really lie, I think. So it seems like to me anyway.
Awesome. Thank you. And I strongly recommend following Dina's writings, her book, a lot of deep, you know, opportunity to really expound on these things. So we have a question from Tegan. Tegan, I'll try and unmute you, or you unmute yourself. I hope we didn't lose her. Oh, good.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
My name's Tegan. I'm a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. I have been in a couple of Dr. King's classes, and she's opened up with like research with me for her boarding school research, and it's been amazing for her. And I thank her for having me in this conversation. I thank you for your time. And I'm a graduate student at NSU, and I have so many questions based off of reading about you, and she told me that you were going to be able to talk to us. And when you said that you teach students not only of Native backgrounds, but of obviously white, Black, many backgrounds, how do you make the point of how Indigenous activism organization, how that has had so many more hurdles than white activism, like you said, white feminism or the Black Power movement, and how Native organization isn't really as acknowledged or recognized? I don't know if that's ever been an issue of how they've perceived Native activism, if they've ever been, if they've ever had to read about it, because so many people I know haven't really heard about the Trail of Broken Treaties or any of that. So I wonder how difficult it is, or if it is a hurdle to get over teaching them about that, or about how Native organizing has been perceived.
My experience teaching is that, and because most of my students are non-Native, so where I teach at San Marcos, the majority of our students are people of color, mostly Hispanic, and only 27% are white. And then we have relatively a large population of Native students. We have the largest population of Native students on our campus than anywhere else in California. And so there are always Native students in the class, always. Sometimes I have as many as 5 or 6, sometimes it's only 1 or 2. And so that always helps with the class discussions. But in my classrooms, those students of color, a lot of them are undocumented. They're dreamers, right? They're students who came to this country undocumented. And so they live under conditions of extreme stress, especially in the last few years. They are already sort of prone to knowing the structural injustice of the United States. So it's really not a hard leap for them to get like the material that they're learning about American history and Indigenous injustice. Like it's not hard for them at all. What I do find invariably in every class I teach, some more than others, but a level of anger. Like students, when they get to my class, they're learning histories that they've never been taught before, like not even close. They have, the most they know about Indians is like their 4th grade mission project. That's what happens here in California. in 4th grade, you get exposed to Indians and you make a mission, like a model of them. I mean, it's stupid. Like they don't do this anymore, although some schools I hear still do it. But so it's virtually, you know, the erasure of Native people, the systematic erasure of people, which happens in education, is very, very much what structures what they do and don't know. So by the time they get to a college class, when they start getting this knowledge, they're pissed. I mean, I see it all the time. They're really angry, and you know, how come I wasn't taught this? And you know, they're pretty much outraged to varying degrees. So so that's something that I've gotten to see. You know, I come to teaching later in life. I've only been teaching, like, at least in the university, for 3 years, so it's a fairly new thing for me. But this is the pattern that I've noticed, is this level of just anger that you know, people feel like they've been lied to their whole lives. And I really don't even have people like try to counter it. Like I know that it happens in classrooms where people, you know, they don't believe you and they think you're just a lefty libtard or whatever. But you know, my experience where I'm at is that they get it. So.
Thank you, Dina. We have a question from Heather next, and I've been really impressed by the students asking questions. And then if some of the non-students with us want to post some questions, just put in the chat box that you'd like to ask a question, and I can call on you next, since we'll try to wrap up soon. So anyone, you know, we can take a couple more questions from community members. But Heather, I'm going to unmute you, or you can unmute yourself. Are you there? There you go. Okay, go ahead, Heather.
Hello, I'm a senior at NSU and a member of Cherokee Nation. I'm majoring in American Indian Studies as well as integrated biology. I was actually reading an article of yours where you mentioned the disregard of indigenous land management in national parks, which kind of struck out to me because of my combination of degrees and my research this semester kind of had to do with indigenous women's roles as kind of a restoration of feminism in Cherokee culture. So my question was, do you feel that it is important and culturally appropriate to reinstitute those methods of indigenous land management in those areas today?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is part of the argument that I keep making everywhere I go, is that indigenous knowledge is critical to human survival. I mean, it's as big as that sounds, and maybe as arrogant as that sounds, as Native people, we know that, right? I mean, this is not rocket science. We lived on our land sustainably for thousands of years without killing ourselves and killing the environment. Although there are examples when we didn't. Like, we learned from our mistakes. Cahokia is a potential example. The Hohokam, civilization in the Southwest is another potential example, where these large, they're sometimes called city-states, although I don't like that term, but these large, very complex societies that existed on this continent centuries before the Europeans even got here, but that came and went by the time the Europeans got here. There is evidence in my research, from what I have read, there's evidence that those people made mistakes. Maybe they overuse the environment, and combined with the drought or some other natural phenomenon, they it caused their societies to fade or to change into something else, right? Because as Southeastern people, Cherokee people, Choctaw people, you know that you are the descendants of those people, the Mississippian cultures. Like you already, you know that. Those are your ancestors. So I wouldn't even say that they disappeared. Like that's the way that the historiography gets written. Oh, they mysteriously disappeared. Bullshit. They didn't mysteriously disappear. They just turned into something else. And you are the embodiment of that adaptation. So we have, even when in the examples where we might say we misuse the environment, you know, we had to learn from those mistakes. So we're not perfect. We're not perfect, but we are extremely experienced land managers. And so we have to draw, and women's knowledge has always been a part of that. So yeah, that has to be talked about. It has to be incorporated into whatever toolboxes are going to be used in science, right? And scientists have to start acknowledging that Indigenous knowledge is not just theoretical, but it's applied knowledge. And you know, there's the work, we could name a number of different scholars whose work exemplify that. So yeah, it's not just, you know, feel good, warm and fuzzy, oh, the Indians, you know, or the original environment. It's not that. It's that there is very specific kinds of land management practices that need to be looked at for, as well, as I always say, as well as this epistemological way, you know, how we as humans live on the earth and what kinds of philosophical foundations do we construct our society on? Are we living, well, we know that we live in a society that is all about domination of the natural world. We, you know, we look at, it's extractive. We look at what, you know, societies use the environment for what they can get out of it and profit from. Whereas from an indigenous epistemological framework, it's about how we live in relationship to it, to ensure everybody's survival, human and non-human alike. So that's what really has to change, and there's lots of knowledge to be applied there.
Great. It looks like we have one more question from an NSU student, Jesselyn. Are you ready to ask that? I can unmute you. Go ahead.
Okay. My question is, do you think that Indigenous feminism is something that is like understood everywhere, or is it only like individually defined? Like my meaning could be like different from yours, or do you think if it is different, if geographical regions like also play a part into it, like being from a rural community or like from like a big city community?
Interesting question. I would say that just like Indigenous knowledge in general is not something, we have to resist the impulse to essentialize it, right? Or to generalize it or to universalize it. The thing about Indigenous knowledge is that there are Indigenous knowledges, just like there are, you know, different women of color feminisms. Our knowledges are based on our very particular connections to particular places, our very particular histories and languages. And of course, language simultaneously reflects and constructs who we are as societies and peoples. So that said, like we bear in mind that there are still commonalities. There are commonalities of, you know, ways that we would look at the world, ways that we approach the world, the ways that we live in the world. Like, well, one of those commonalities is, you know, understanding the relationality of our orientation to the world and to non-human life. That's a commonality, and we can safely generalize about that with Indigenous societies on Turtle Island. As far as feminisms go, I think it's probably this, I would say it's similar to that. I think there are things that we can generalize about it, such as, Indigenous, we can safely say that Indigenous feminism differs from other feminisms in our projects to protect sovereignty, and to revitalize our own traditions around, gender equity. But that'll look different, I think, from tribe to tribe. Like, what gender equity looked like in Sinixt society or Silk society, which is where I'm from, is different than or is perhaps different than what gender equity looks like in Cherokee or Haudenosaunee or Pueblo, right? So those are very different. And I would also say, somebody who teaches religion too, that religion is a huge part of this. And this is, I didn't even touch on that, but religion is a huge factor in this, how Christianity has changed our societies and the way it inserts itself, and has contributed to that colonial patriarchy. So, and how tribes negotiate that is really different. I mean, if you, look at there's a whole study on how Christianity is expressed in Crow society. And you could write, Crows, like, what, I'm getting a little tangential here, but, the Hopis pretty much rejected Christianity, whereas, the Crows embraced it wildly, and they have like 35 different like churches of national denominations on their reservations. So it's really different from region to region. So we have to always, I think, keep that in mind, that what gender equity and gender power dynamics mean is different from tribe to tribe, region to region.
Thank you, Dina, for answering all these questions and staying with us and joining us and sharing of your experiences, insights, research, knowledge. It's always very enlightening and illuminating. So thank you. And I hope everyone carries this with them. And I appreciate it. It's hard to even, I especially appreciate ending with those comments, because I think one of the most important things I try to teach in Indigenous and Native studies is just that we are already in comparison, like it's comparative studies because of the diversity, and you can't just blanket, widely blanket and wash over all this diversity and intricacy of peoples. And that's the beauty of it, is that complexity of humanity and of all these different experiences where we can have these common human experiences, which I see that thread in a lot of your comments too. But that's what I love, and I'm glad you addressed that question and those kind of issues and dynamics, and thank you for that. We have a number of people just thanking you on the chat box.
Yeah, I'm seeing it. Yeah, thank you so much. It's been delightful. I'm sorry I was late too, but this has been, thank you so much for your engagement, and go out there and do good things. Stir the pot and make people think about things from your perspective.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for admirable, inspiring, informative, appreciated your time, your knowledge and wisdom, and they're very grateful for this opportunity. So thank you, and we're excited that we have recorded this so we can share this on the Center for Tribal Studies Facebook page. And thank you, Dina. Please all take care, stay well. Blessings, prayers, and best wishes for everyone during this challenging time, especially our Indigenous communities and peoples. Protect our peoples, and seeing I like the mention of the reference to also that relations and this interdependence between not just humans, right, but our environments, are all things around us. So thank you very much. Thank you, and take care. Stay well.
You too.
All right, thank you. I'll close the meeting. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.